For 20 years, she wasn't allowed in the barn. Her husband forbade it, his word as firm as fence posts sunk in hard earth. Clara Hayes had asked once in the beginning, back when she was still young enough to think marriage was a negotiation rather than a binding of two stubborn lives. Walter had just finished nailing a new padlock on the barn door, its brass face gleaming against the grey wood like something that didn't belong. She had laughed, light-hearted, thinking maybe he was hiding Christmas gifts or old family heirlooms. But his eyes had carried no humour. "Not in there," he said, brushing dust from his hands. "Not ever. It ain't safe." And that was that. He turned and walked back toward the fields, as though the matter were closed, and in his mind it was. Clara had learned early that Walter's silences weighed more than most men's words. They lived on the edge of Milford, Kansas, where the horizon rolled flat and endless, a prairie sea under skies that could be cruel in winter and merciless in summer. Their farmhouse was plain, white clapboards weathered to grey, a roof patched more times than she could count, a porch swing that groaned like an old man. But to Clara, it had been a palace compared to the narrow townhome she had grown up in. She had married Walter at 25, full of hope and ready for the life she imagined on a farm. Fresh mornings, rows of wheat swaying like golden rivers, maybe children tumbling through the grass. Walter was older, 40 when they wed, his hair already salted with grey, his shoulders bent from decades of chores. He didn't speak much of dreams, but he worked steady, and Clara thought steadiness was enough to build a life on. The barn stood behind the house, not grand but solid, its red paint peeled to the bare boards in places, its roofline sagging slightly to the west. It had been part of the Hayes farm for generations. Walter's father had worked cattle in there, and his father before him. Clara knew barns. She knew the smell of hay and manure, the squeak of doors, the flutter of pigeons in rafters. She knew that barns held life and death in equal measure, but she did not know what lived in this one, for Walter's lock held her out like a hand pressed against her chest. At first, she accepted it. Men needed their corners, she told herself. Walter was a man of the land, set in his ways, and perhaps this was simply another habit carved by time. But as the years stacked one upon another, her curiosity deepened into something heavier. She saw him slip out at night with a lantern, his boots crunching gravel, the light bobbing across the yard as he disappeared into the barn. Sometimes she would wake at dawn and find him already there, the door closed, no sound leaking out. Packages came in the mail, odd ones wrapped in brown paper, heavier than clothes or books, lighter than tools. He carried them under his arm and went straight to the barn. "Just farm supplies," he said when she asked. But farm supplies usually came by feed truck, not by post. Walter never raised his voice to her, never raised a hand. His refusals were gentle but unyielding. "It's mine," he would say when she pressed. "Leave it." And though she wanted to demand more, something in his tone made her stop. He was not hiding in shame. It was something else, something sorrowful that tightened his jaw whenever she looked too long at the barn. So she let it be. They tried for children in those early years. Nights of hope, months of waiting, the slow erosion of optimism when the calendar turned with no news. After 2 years, they drove to Wichita to see a doctor. Tests, blood work, quiet waiting rooms painted in colors meant to soothe. The verdict was that nothing was wrong, and yet everything was. Unexplained infertility, the specialist said, as though naming it gave comfort. It did not. They tried another clinic in Kansas City, endured the same exams, the same hollow reassurances. Still, no child came. Clara kept a small box in the closet. It wasn't large, an old cedar box with a brass clasp gone dull with years, but inside it held the weight of her abandoned hope. She had lined it with tissue paper, yellowed at the edges now, and nestled there were the tokens she could never quite let go of. A pair of baby socks, embroidered with tiny sheep, so small she could balance them on 2 fingers. A rattle shaped like a star, its paint chipped from years of being handled and put away, as though even dreams could wear down with time. A blanket soft as summer wind, folded into a neat square, still carrying the faintest trace of lavender from the last time she had washed it in preparation for a child who never came. Some nights, when the house was quiet and Walter had already slipped into the deep, even breathing of sleep, she would take the box down from its shelf. Sitting on the edge of the bed or kneeling on the rug, she would open the lid with slow reverence, as if it contained relics of another life. She pressed the socks against her cheek, their softness almost unbearable. She shook the rattle once, a muted chime that seemed both tender and mocking in the silence. She unfolded the blanket and draped it across her lap, smoothing her palms over its worn surface, as if, in some hidden seam, it might still carry the warmth of a child she had once dared to imagine. And then, just as carefully, she would fold it all back away, tucking each piece into its place before Walter saw. She could not bear his silence if he were to catch her, silence that was heavier than any words. They never spoke of adoption, they never spoke of fostering. The words hovered between them sometimes, like birds that might land but always wheeled away before finding ground. Clara thought of them often, letters she wrote in her mind, questions she rehearsed but never delivered. But Walter's silence on the matter was a wall she couldn't scale. He wasn't unkind. He never raised his voice, never shut her down with cruelty, but he was unmovable. His grief had hardened into something like granite, and every time she pressed against it, she felt herself bruising. Walter carried his sorrow inward, a stone lodged in his chest. He rarely named it, never offered it in pieces she could hold. It lived in the lines of his face, in the way he lingered too long at the fence line watching the neighbors' children play, in the heaviness with which he closed doors. Clara carried hers differently. She hid it in the shadows of the house, in the closet where the box lived, in the unsent letters she scribbled on scraps of paper and burned in the stove. She carried it in the silence of the evenings, in the way she folded laundry with hands too steady, in the pauses she held when she passed by the locked barn and let her eyes rest there longer than she should. Seasons passed in their rhythm, as steady as breath. The wheat rose in golden seas and fell to stubble. Calves staggered into the world on wobbly legs, and pigs squealed in protest before their fates were sealed. Storms came tearing across the plains with a roar that shook the windows, lightning carving jagged scars across the horizon, thunder rattling the dishes in the cupboard. Then calm would return, the sky spreading wide and endless, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. Walter worked with the constancy of a clock. His hands grew rougher each year, his back bent a little more with each season's labor. His eyes, always scanning sky and soil, seemed tuned to things Clara could not see, the tilt of a cloud, the lean of a stalk, the whisper of oncoming change. He lived by the land's pulse, and though his face rarely betrayed it, she knew he loved it in the way he rose before dawn without complaint, in the way he lingered after dusk to set one more fence post straight. Clara tended the house, the garden, the chickens that pecked around her skirts. She found comfort in small order, rows of beans tied neatly, jars of preserves stacked by colour, linens folded with precision. She volunteered at the Milford church, helping with suppers, teaching Sunday school. Her smile practiced enough that most believed it. Evenings were quiet. She read books by lamplight, losing herself in other lives, or sat on the porch with her knitting, her needles clicking softly while cicadas sang in the dark. From where she sat, she could see Walter's lantern flickering in the barn, a small pulse of light in the sea of shadow. And always, she grew used to the padlock, though never fully numb to it. At first it had screamed at her, each glint of sun on the metal a reminder of what she was shut out from. Later, it dulled into part of the scenery, a thing she passed each day the way one passes a scar in a mirror. Familiar, unavoidable, painful in its quiet persistence. It became part of the landscape, a scar on the farm she could not explain. When Walter turned 60, the years showed heavily in him. His hair was near white, his frame leaner. He spoke even less than before. Clara sometimes wondered if she had become invisible to him, though he still laid a hand on her shoulder in passing, still brought her coffee in the mornings. It was a distance born not of rejection, but of some private ache. She had stopped asking about the barn by then, but it never left her thoughts. Then came the illness. It began with pain in his gut that he dismissed as indigestion. Then weight loss he explained as too much work, not enough rest. But Clara saw more. She saw how he winced climbing the porch steps, how his face paled after lifting hay bales, how he sat longer and longer in his chair at night. She made the appointment in Topeka herself. Walter went without protest, which frightened her more than if he had refused. The doctor's words came like stones: pancreatic cancer, advanced, inoperable. Months, not years. They drove home in silence. Walter stared out the truck window at the rolling fields, and Clara stared at her hands on the wheel, gripping so hard her knuckles blanched. When they pulled into the yard, he got out without a word and walked toward the barn. He unlocked the door and slipped inside, leaving her standing in the gravel, the sun setting behind him. In the weeks that followed, she became his caretaker. She learned how to measure pills, cook bland meals he could keep down, help him into bed when his legs trembled. Some days he managed the porch, staring at the horizon with a kind of resignation. Other days he lay quiet, his breath shallow, his eyes far away. Clara sat beside him, holding his hand, reading aloud even when she wasn't sure he heard. She tried to keep the house bright, tried to keep her voice steady, but grief seeped in like water through cracked stone. It was during one of those porch evenings that Walter spoke of the barn. His voice was thin, his hand trembling where it rested on hers. "Promise me," he said, "when I'm gone, don't go in there." The words landed heavy. Clara felt her throat tighten. She wanted to ask why, to demand the truth he had held from her for 2 decades, but when she looked at his eyes, she saw not fear but sorrow. So deep and old, it seemed to come from before their marriage, before their life together. She nodded. "I promise," she whispered, though the words burned in her mouth. Walter died one morning before sunrise. Clara woke to stillness beside her, his hand resting cool and slack in hers. She sat there until the sun rose, until the fields lit golden, until she could bring herself to call the pastor and the funeral home. The service was small: neighbors, a few cousins, men from the feed store. They lowered him into the ground beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow sound. Clara did not cry. Her grief was a stone lodged too deep for tears. The farm fell silent in the days that followed. She moved through the house like a shadow, sorting his clothes, folding away his boots, leaving his hat on the hook by the door because she could not bear to touch it. From the kitchen window, she saw the barn each morning, its padlock catching the sun. The promise she had made felt like a chain around her chest. She tried to honor it, but the weight grew heavier with each passing day. 3 nights after the funeral, while sorting his papers in the nightstand, she found an envelope. Inside was a single brass key, dull with age. Her breath caught. She knew instantly what it was for. She closed the drawer quickly, her hands shaking, and left it untouched for 2 more days. But on the 3rd morning, with the sky pale and the dew still wet on the grass, Clara slipped the key into her pocket and walked barefoot across the yard. The lock gave way with a soft click. She pushed the door open, her heart thundering in her chest. Dust rose in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the gaps in the boards. She braced herself for tools, for hidden machinery, for something dark and unexplainable. What she found instead made her knees buckle. The barn was a nursery. Children's drawings covered the walls, stick figures of a family holding hands beneath a bright sun, scrawled in crayon and marker. A small bookshelf leaned against one wall, filled with worn picture books. A crib stood in the corner, painted white, a knitted blanket folded neatly inside. Stuffed animals sat on shelves. A rabbit missing an ear, a bear with button eyes, a train set laid carefully across the floor as if waiting for little hands. Above the crib hung a mobile of carved wooden stars, turning slowly in the draught. On a table rested a notebook. Clara picked it up with trembling fingers. On the first page, in Walter's blocky handwriting, were the words, "Diary of a Father. For you, my child, if you ever find this." She sank onto the floor and began to read. The entries stretched back nearly 20 years. The handwriting shifted with time, sometimes firm and deliberate, sometimes jagged, as though written in the dark with trembling hands. He wrote of building the crib, each nail driven with both hope and fear. He wrote of buying toys in secret, tucking them into corners of the barn so Clara would never stumble upon them too soon. He confessed to sneaking into the barn at night, lantern low, to sit in the rocker and imagine the life they never had. Sometimes he named the child Ben, picturing him chasing grasshoppers across the summer fields. Other times Grace, her voice bright as wind chimes in the spring. And sometimes only you, a presence both shadow and promise, a soul he longed for, but could never hold. He described planting wheat in the cool dawn, and how, in his mind, a small figure ran laughing along the rows, chasing after him. He described buying the stuffed elephant, because he has kind eyes and will guard your dreams. Words so tender that Clara felt her breath catch as she read them. There were pages about Clara, too. He noticed everything. How her shoulders stiffened at the mention of neighbors' children. How her smile faltered in church when babies were passed from one set of arms to another. He wrote that he saw her grief even when she thought she hid it, that her silence was louder to him than any cry. "I wanted to protect you," one entry read. "I wanted to shield you from the cruel weight of believing it was your fault." And then, in one shaky entry, the ink blotted where the pen must have paused on the page. "You didn't. None of this was your fault. This was the only way I knew to keep believing." Clara pressed her face against the crib rail and wept. The wood was cool against her skin, but her tears made it warm, alive with the weight of all that had been carried here in secret. Years of silence broke loose, grief for the child that never came, grief for the man who bore his sorrow quietly so she might not drown in hers, grief for the life they had both lived half hidden, walking side by side but never speaking aloud of the emptiness between them. Her sobs came in waves, shaking her shoulders until she clutched the rail like an anchor. The barn held her sound, absorbing it into its beams, its rafters, its dust-softened corners. It was as if the space itself had been waiting for this flood, waiting for the walls to be washed clean by her voice at last. She stayed there until the sun was high, until the light shifted across the floorboards and painted the crib in gold. Her tears soaked the wood, darkened it, marked it as something both mourned and sanctified. And in that long stillness after the storm of her weeping, she realized the barn no longer felt forbidden, but sacred. In the weeks that followed, she returned every morning. The barn, once a place she had not dared to enter, became part of her daily rhythm, as essential as her morning coffee or the sound of the wind through the wheat. She dusted the shelves slowly, pausing at times to trace her fingertips over the spines of books that had never been opened. She washed the toys, dipping each faded block and worn wooden horse in soapy water, as though she were baptizing them into a second life. She hung new curtains to let in light, choosing ones patterned with soft blues and yellows, colors that made the room glow even on cloudy mornings. The scent of fresh fabric and clean wood filled the air, mingling with the earthy smell of hay that drifted in from outside. At first, her voice trembled when she read the books aloud to the empty room. The words snagged in her throat, caught between memory and longing. But she kept at it, page after page, until her voice grew steady, warm, even playful. Sometimes she caught herself laughing at the silly rhymes, or pausing to hold up the pictures to no one in particular, as if the room itself were listening. She began to imagine that the walls remembered the sound of Walter's footsteps, and now they listened just as eagerly for hers. One morning, while reaching beneath the crib to sweep away dust, she found another notebook tucked carefully into the shadows. Her hands shook as she pulled it free, the leather cover soft from years of being handled. This one was addressed to her. The sight of her name written in Walter's uneven scrawl stopped her breath. She sat down heavily on the rocker, opened the notebook, and began to read. Walter had written that he built the room not to punish or deceive, but to preserve hope. His words spilled across the pages in sentences that seemed to breathe, each one carrying the weight of love and sorrow interwoven. "If you find this, know that I loved you more than words. I kept this not because you failed me, but because I couldn't bear to see that look in your eyes again. You gave me everything. This was for us." Clara clutched the notebook to her chest, tears running silently down her face. She rocked forward and back, her sobs muffled against the worn cover. Yet the tears felt different this time, not sharp with loss, but softened by the certainty of his love. For the first time since his death, she felt his presence not as an ache, but as a steady warmth, like sunlight resting on her shoulders after a long winter. She carried that warmth with her into the days that followed. The barn became more than a room. It became a living reminder of resilience. She found herself humming while she worked in the kitchen, tending her garden with a lighter step, even pausing to chat with neighbors she had once avoided in her grief. The world outside the farm, which had seemed distant and muted for so long, began to call her back with small but insistent gestures. At the Milford Library, where she had once volunteered in another lifetime, the director recognized her in the stacks and asked gently if she might help with children's story hour. Clara hesitated, the old fear pressing at her ribs, but then she thought of Walter's notebook, of the way his words urged her to live as though love still had a place in her days. She said yes. On her first afternoon back, she opened one of the same picture books that lined the barn's shelves. Her hands trembled as the children gathered around her, eyes bright, voices whispering with excitement. She began to read, her voice shaky at first, but as the children leaned closer, she grew steadier, her tone lifting with the rhythm of the story. The children laughed at the funny parts, clapped when she turned the last page, and their joy seeped into her like rain into parched soil. For the first time in years, she laughed too, her shoulders shaking with a sound she had thought was gone from her forever. Life continued to press gently at the edges of her solitude. At the farmer's market, where she had gone only for bread and apples in the past, she found herself lingering. She admired the bright rows of vegetables, the jars of honey catching sunlight like liquid amber, the children darting between stalls with sticky fingers and wide smiles. One morning, as she was weighing tomatoes, a mother beside her handed over her baby so she could reach for a bundle of carrots. Clara, startled, accepted the small weight in her arms. The baby blinked up at her, soft fists curling, breath warm against her chest. Clara froze, afraid the old pain might surge and undo her. But instead, something unexpected stirred deep inside. Not the familiar ache of absence, but a new current moving through her, gentle and insistent. It wasn't pain. It wasn't regret. It was something else entirely. Readiness. She began volunteering with the foster agency, first sorting donations, then sitting with children during visits, reading, helping with homework. At first, her steps into that world were tentative, as though she were walking on thin ice. The laughter of children in the playroom made her chest ache. The sudden quiet of a sad goodbye could undo her for hours. Yet she stayed, because something in her had shifted. The barn had opened her heart again, and now she found herself opening doors for others too. She did not rush into decisions, but she let herself imagine a future she had once thought closed. She could picture herself holding a small hand, guiding a little one through the same rows of corn Walter had once walked with her. She let herself consider that love did not always arrive in the form we expected. It could come as a child in need, a community leaning on her, or even a memory so strong it asked to be shared rather than hidden. Each night she returned to the barn, sat in the old rocker she had placed by the crib, and wrote her own entries in a new notebook. She did not write with the urgency of grief anymore, but with the steady rhythm of someone making room for both the past and the future. She wrote to the child they never had, to Walter, to herself. "We are still here," she wrote. "We are still full of love." She signed each entry not with her name, but with yours, as though she was speaking from the heart of the family that had almost been, and still somehow was. Some nights, the words poured out like a river, stories she wished she could tell a child at bedtime, memories of how Walter once laughed so hard he nearly tipped backward in a chair, gentle encouragements she whispered to herself when the house felt too empty. Other nights, she wrote just a single sentence, a fragment of hope, or a reminder that even silence had meaning. The notebook filled slowly, but every page felt like planting a seed in ground she had once believed barren. One afternoon, while cleaning, she found a box of folded papers beneath the crib. The dust on the lid was thick, as though years had tried to seal it shut, but her hands trembled with a kind of reverence as she lifted it free. Inside, the slips of paper were worn soft with time, creased by fingers that had held them often. Each slip held a name Walter had once imagined for their child. Emma, Jack, Lily, Orion, Halo. She read them aloud, her voice breaking slightly on each syllable, as though she were summoning ghosts who had always been waiting to be called. On the back of each, he had written small notes. Brave laugh, love stars, curious. The words were simple, but in them, Clara heard the full depth of Walter's dreaming. He had imagined not only names but entire souls, fragments of lives he would never meet, but had carried close to his heart. She pressed the slips to her chest, feeling for a moment as if Walter were right there beside her, whispering each imagined quality into the air between them. Clara spread them across the rug, touching each one with reverence. The barn filled with a quiet light that afternoon, sun spilling through the cracks and laying stripes of gold across the papers. She sat cross-legged, surrounded by names and qualities, as though she were in the center of a galaxy her husband had built out of longing and love. She stayed like that for a long while, breathing slowly, letting the presence of both absence and abundance wash over her. Finally, she gathered them into a jar and placed it on the shelf, a constellation of the children they had never met but had loved all the same. The barn was no longer forbidden. It had become a sanctuary, a place where grief and love lived side by side. Clara kept it open, the door ajar so the Kansas wind could move through, carrying with it the scent of wheat and earth. At night she sat in the rocker, the mobile of stars turning above her, and felt the presence of the man who had once locked this place away, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate, tender hope. Sometimes she would run her hands along the beams, rough-hewn and scarred with the work of years, and wonder how many times Walter had paused here, listening to the creak of the rafters or the restless shuffle of animals once kept inside. She had hated the closed door for so long, resented it as a wall between them, but now she understood. It had been his way of holding on, of protecting something fragile within himself that he could not name aloud. And as she traced the wood, she felt her resentment dissolve into a quiet gratitude. In the evenings, when the horizon burned with that wide Kansas sunset, Clara gathered a lamp and set it just inside the doorway. Its glow stretched across the fields, soft and golden, as if summoning back everything she thought she had lost. Neighbors noticed. They would pass on horseback or in old trucks, tip their hats or wave, and in their glances she saw they understood too, that the barn was no longer a place of silence, but of belonging. Children from town would come with books in hand, eager to sit on bales of hay while she read, their laughter bouncing from the rafters like the echoes of a new generation stitching itself to the past. Clara never spoke of Walter in lectures or sermons, but she carried him into every word. When she taught a child to sound out a difficult phrase, she remembered his patience. When she bent to tie a little one's shoe, she thought of his hands, cracked and strong, guiding plough reins with the same gentleness he once used to lift her chin. She knew he had not been perfect, but he had tried, and that trying had built a foundation more enduring than stone. The nights were the hardest, when the prairie fell silent, and the world seemed to stretch so wide she feared she might dissolve into it. Yet even then, the barn held her steady. The rocker beneath her groaned like an old friend, and the smell of earth rose through the boards, reminding her she was rooted here, that she belonged. Above her the stars swung in their endless pattern, slow and patient, as though keeping time with a grief that had become less jagged, more like a river, smoothing its stones. In those moments she sometimes spoke aloud, words carried off by the wind, but meant for him. She told him about the children's progress, about how the youngest brown boy finally learned to write his name without turning the S backward, or how Mrs. Keating down the road sent fresh bread every Wednesday, as if feeding Clara could somehow fill the emptiness she carried. She told him she forgave him for the locked door, that she understood now it was not punishment but protection. For her, for him, for the fragile hope of something they had once dreamed together. The barn itself seemed to change with her. Where dust had long gathered, she swept. Where cobwebs clung, she cleared them away. She planted flowers by the threshold, wild sunflowers and black-eyed Susans, that leaned toward the light as though eager to be part of this rebirth. The walls no longer echoed only with memory. They breathed with presence, with community, with the sound of children's questions and the occasional hymn she hummed under her breath. And when storms rolled across the prairie, heavy with thunder, she stood at the doorway and held her ground. The barn shook, as it always had, but no longer felt fragile. It was a place remade, not by nails or wood, but by acceptance, by the choice to let grief stand alongside love, instead of against it. Walter Hayes had not been a father in the traditional sense, but in these walls he had dreamed as one, loved as one, mourned as one. Clara carried that truth with her now, into every book she read to children, into every hand she held, into every quiet morning she stepped into the barn. And though he was gone, the dream he built lived on, in her, in the community she touched, in the light that spilled from the barn across the Kansas prairie like a promise finally kept.